SAT example number 84 is the type of problem that's a little tougher theoretically when you're given three choices and it asks you which of the three choices must be true. You have to consider more than one possible number often. So we're going to start with x equaling -1. It says x is a negative number, so let's keep it as simple as possible. So if x equals -1, let's just go down the list. X to the fifth would be -1 raised to the fifth power is less than the absolute value of x, which would be the absolute value of -1. So let me just go ahead and replace that. Absolute value of -1. Well, -1 to the fifth. See, you have to know the fact that any negative number, if you raise it to an odd power, it's going to remain negative regardless. So the left-hand side is always going to be negative. And if you think about this, the right-hand side, the absolute value of -1 is positive. So a negative number less than a positive number, well, that's always going to be true. If x is negative, that has to be true. So we know that one's true in this specific case and also in general. So as you do these, you want to think in generalities also. The second case, x is less than the square root of -x. Well, let's just take our number, -1 again, and test it. So -1 is less than the square root of -x, would be the negative of x. So the negative of -1, which is the same as -1 is less than the square root of +1. Well, again, that's true. And again, if it's true, then you want to think, well, in general, does that have to be true? And again, the left-hand side is going to remain negative. If you stick a negative number in for x, it's going to stay negative. The right-hand side, when you take a negative number and make it negative, the negative of a negative number just turns it positive. So it's very similar to case 1, where the left-hand side is negative, the right-hand side is always positive, so that's always going to be true. And then the third case is a little tougher, maybe. X minus 1 over the absolute value of x. So we start with -1, and you're going to subtract 1 over the absolute value of -1. So that becomes -1 minus 1 over 1, which is 1, which is -2. Well, that's true. That's less than 0, but is that always going to be true? Again, think about this. The first number, x, is negative. And if you subtract what becomes a positive number because of the absolute value, if you start with a negative and subtract a positive, that makes the number even smaller. So it keeps getting smaller and smaller, and if it starts negative and gets smaller, then it still has to be less than 0. So choice 3 is also always true. So this problem is a little tougher. You have to not only think of specific examples that work, but you also have to think, does that always hold true for all negative numbers? And it does. So 1, 2, and 3, excuse me, choice A. Done.